Before we begin, if you're listening late at night, let me know the time and place in the comments below. Are you in your bed, on a night shift, somewhere quiet? We read every story you share, and if this kind of soft, forgotten history helps you rest, a gentle tap on subscribe keeps the stories coming. It's no alarms, no drama. It's a slow, true history to fall asleep to. Now, close your eyes if you like. We're going back quietly to the ruins of the Roman Empire. Asterisk, in the final centuries of the Roman Empire, food was not just sustenance, it was control. Bread was not merely baked, it was power, kneaded into loaves and handed out in colosseums. And grain was not just grown, it was shipped, tracked, weighed, and prayed over. Because if even one ship failed to arrive, people would not eat. You were in Rome now. It's not the glory-drenched Rome of marble speeches and imperial trumpets, but the weary Rome of the 4th century. The empire still stretches wide on paper, from Britannia's muddy fields to the rocky deserts of Syria. But those are only lines on scrolls. On the ground, things are slipping. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. Roads that once bustled now echo. Bureaucrats complain of ink shortages. Coins feel lighter. Gangs begin to ache. Rome, the city, depends on the sea on Egypt, specifically. For centuries, the grain ships from Alexandria were its lifeline. Every harvest season, fleets were loaded with sacks of wheat bound for the capital. Following the Nile down to the Mediterranean, then hugging the coast to reach Ostia, Rome's port. From there, the grain was carted or floated up the Tiber to the hungry mouths of the city. This system worked until it didn't. In one bitter autumn, time in the late 300s, a delay occurred. Not a dramatic one, just a delay. A storm off the Libyan coast, a lack of rowers, pirates, rumors of a revolt, a priver in the Nile Delta. The usual whispers. But the result was this. The grain ship never came. People didn't panic at first. Rome had reserves, warehouses full of them. But many of those warehouses, it turned out, had been mismanaged or emptied in secret to pay debts. A few were raided. One was burned, so the queues outside the bakeries grew longer. Bakers, citing supply shortages, raised prices. Then they shut their doors. Riots broke out near the Suburra. The city prefect, ready under pressure from the emperor, issued an order. Bread must be rationed. It wasn't the first time, but it felt worse in better years when Rome ruled with confidence. Such hiccups were absorbed. The system compensated. An extra ship could be redirected. A new decree could summon grain from Carthage or Sicily. Those places were failing too. Carthage had tax troubles. Sicily had just suffered a drought. And no one, it seemed, was eager to feed the capital of a faltering empire anymore. At the same time, rural Roman farmers, those in Latium and Campania who might have sold grain to Rome, refused. Why? Because transporting food to the capital was now dangerous. Bandits patrolled old roads. Bridges had collapsed and were never rebuilt. And even if the grain arrived, payments came in worthless coin or unfulfilled promises. Inside the city, the rich hoarded what they had. Few senatorial families owning private farms became kings in miniature. They fortified their villas and hired guards. Some of them, in secret, traded food, not for money, but for loyalty, arms, influence. The poor suffered most. They always had, but this time it was different. The old welfare grain doles, once a point of civic pride, had become erratic. And when they stopped altogether that winter, many simply left. They walked out of the city, barefoot, through gates, no longer guarded. Rome shrank, quietly. Houses emptied. Stalls closed. The forum fell eerily silent. The emperor at the time, Valentinian II, issued orders. He blamed governors in Egypt. He replaced prefects. He demanded audits, but little changed. The sea remained indifferent. Some of the missing ships may have sunk. Others may have been redirected to feed garrisons in North Africa or Gaul. A few were simply too late. When one did arrive, months later, it caused chaos. Fights broke out at the port. The ship's captain, unsure who was still in charge, held back the cargo until bribes were paid. By then, dozens had died from hunger in the alleys of the Aventine. A senator wrote in his journal, "The people now chew weeds. We smell the kitchens of the rich as if they are temples of another god." Even the temples, once symbols of civic faith, were empty. The priests no longer conducted rites, not out of rebellion, but because many had left. And why not? Their stipends had stopped. 2. All because of one ship, or rather, the absence of it. But maybe the real problem wasn't that the ship didn't come, but that the empire had become too fragile to survive the weight. So here we are left to wonder, how did the capital of the world become a city that starved silently without siege or flame? Asterisk, you wake in a city where ovens are cold, where the smell of baking bread, once a sign of Rome's eternal heart, has vanished into the damp stones of forgotten mornings. Rome was not built on conquest alone. It was built on grain, on daily routines, on flat loaves handed out by clerks behind marble counters, on the regular rattle of donkey carts delivering flour to crowded neighborhoods. For the average Roman Empire wasn't a banner, it was bread. And now, bread had disappeared. After the failed shipment, the city adjusted. But the adjustment was not the kind that gets recorded in grand speeches or carved into stone. It was quiet, slow, a fraying of the social cloth. In districts like Trastevere, people began selling family heirlooms just to buy what little grain remained. Not bags, just handfuls. A few women turned to grinding acorns, trying to mimic flour. It didn't work. Gave people stomach cramps, then illness, but hunger made them try again the next day. Priest Avesta, whose duty was to keep the sacred flame alive, began begging for food outside the temples. The flame itself, some said, flickered weakly. The city, once terrified of omens, no longer had the energy to fear. Bread riots didn't just erupt, they lingered. They became part of daily life, as regular as sunrise. People scrawled graffiti on the forum walls, "Give us flour," not festivals. Others blamed the emperor, others the gods. Most blamed the sea. Some blamed the past. In truth, Rome had spent centuries building a system too large to hold. Its population had grown fat on grain doles, but the empire had failed to evolve its supply lines. The roads were crumbling. The ports were underfunded. The imperial navy had no proper oversight. Pirates could pluck cargo with impunity. Sometimes the grain was stolen. Other times it simply spoiled at sea. And still, life in the palace continued. In the Palatine, where the emperor resided, the kitchens remained stocked. Court scribes made note of the shortages in their ledgers, but the bureaucracy did not break stride. Taxes were still demanded even from citizens who no longer ate. Rome's population, once estimated at 1 million, may have dropped by half within just a generation. People moved outward to the countryside, to other cities. Even cities under threat from barbarians seemed safer than a capital where mothers wrapped empty baskets in cloth, pretending to their children that food waited inside. The bakeries, those narrow, smoky, soot-blackened spaces that had once been the heartbeat of Roman street life, shut their wooden shutters for good. Some were looted and never reopened. Others were quietly repurposed. One was turned into a chapel. Another became a stable for a senator's last horse. Old customs eroded too. Dana, the Roman grain dole system, which had distributed, subsidized bread for centuries, became a ghost. Its clerks still filed forms, still listed names, still posted rosters, but there was nothing to give. And still, the people came. Some did not believe the grain was gone. They thought it had been hidden, hoarded, diverted. A rumor spread that a ship had docked quietly at Ostia, and its entire cargo had been sent north to feed soldiers, not citizens. There was no proof, but in desperate times, rumor feeds faster than bread. One afternoon, in a small square not far from the Forum Boreum, a group of hungry men seized a tax official. He had arrived to collect levies from a wine merchant, a mother absurdity in a city starving. The crowd tore his tablets from his hands and demanded he reveal the hidden storehouses. He had nothing to reveal. He was only a minor bureaucrat, but by evening he had vanished. The prefect of the city, Lucius Aurelius Amachus, a man born to a senatorial family, wrote letters to the emperor. He described the shortages, the riots, the empty streets. He asked for a doubling of grain imports from Africa. He never received a reply. Historians suspect the message was intercepted or ignored. Some in the Senate demanded a ceremonial sacrifice to the old gods. Others, now Christians, said prayer was enough. Neither effort produced grain. What it did produce, however, was division, arguments, whispers, accusations that the Christians had cursed the city by abandoning Jupiter, accusations that the pagans had brought divine judgment upon Rome. This theological conflict soon seeped into the grain issue. Priests blamed rival priests. Bishops refused to share reserves with temples. The gods became hungry. To dot, meanwhile, beyond the walls, the empire continued to rot at its edges. Goths pushed south. Vandals circled, but these distant threats barely registered with the starving poor. Man cannot fear invasion when his ribs showed through his tunic. Instead, attention turned inward, not to war but to who was eating. Those with land, with connections, with slaves to guard their estates, grew powerful. They no longer needed the city. And in return, the city no longer had any claim over them. For the first time in centuries, loyalty shifted from the idea of Rome to the promise of bread. Not ideology, but survival. Some called this the beginning of feudalism, but no one called it anything at the time. They just called it staying alive. In one particularly well-preserved letter from a widow named Galla, dated around 394 CE, she pleads with her brother in Ravenna to send her children barley. She writes, "They chew stale lentils and weep. My son licked a stone, saying it smelled of bread." No response from her brother survives. Others simply left no letters, no words, just bones. When a modest excavation was carried out in the 19th century near the Aventine Hill, archaeologists found shallow graves dating to the late 4th century. The remains were thin, malnourished, buried without ceremony. One still held a bakery token clutched in his hand, an ivory disc used to claim bread that never came. So Rome shrank further. Not in height or grandeur, those buildings still stood, but in pulse, in warmth, in the small, forgotten act of baking. The empire had taught the world to build roads, aqueducts, armies, forums, and laws, but it had forgotten how to feed itself. And, all the while, people whispered a single question behind closed shutters. If the city cannot bring bread, is it still Rome? By the time the grain ships returned, Rome had already adjusted to their absence. It happened not with celebration, but with indifference. No bells rang, no crowds formed at the docks of Ostia. The men who unloaded the sacks of wheat did so silently. There was no one to cheer them. Many of the people who might have once lined the harbor walls, hoping, straining to see the white sails of relief, were gone. Some had died. Some had fled. Some had learned how to survive without waiting. In the city itself, old bakeries were reopened, but without enthusiasm. The hearths were relit, the stones swept clean, but the spirit had changed. No one believed in permanence anymore. Everything felt like a reprieve, not a recovery. Bread returned, but not Rome, not as it once was. The distributions resumed in a reduced form. The grain dole lists were thinned. Some names were never reinstated. They had either vanished from the census or from the earth itself. Others had been blacklisted for disorder or protest. The clerk's stylus, once a tool of mercy, had become a quiet blade. But even the restored grain lacked power. It no longer symbolized empire. It symbolized dependency. It reminded the people of what had failed. And even as loaves reappeared in the markets, so did silence. You could walk entire streets in the late 390s and hear nothing but the wind. The fountains still burbled. The stones still echoed, but Rome had become hollow like a beautiful amphora with nothing inside. A city that had once measured time by ships now watched them dock without joy, because everyone had learned the truth. The grain might return, but it could vanish again. In the Senate, debate shifted. It's not about food, but about the nature of the city itself. Some senators suggested decentralizing grain storage. Others argued for moving more authority to Ravenna, a city further north, more defensible, and closer to newer ports. These were not radical ideas. They were survival instincts, but survival erodes pride. For the first time in centuries, serious voices asked, what is the purpose of Rome, if not to feed its people? The answers were not inspiring. Some claimed Rome was still the spiritual heart of the empire. Others said its buildings alone justified its greatness. A few cited tradition. But even tradition, starved, can wither. There was a time when emperors feared the Roman mob more than any foreign army. Now, the mob had thinned, and the emperors no longer lived in Rome at all. They ruled from Milan, or Ravenna, or from battlefield tents. Rome had become symbolic, and symbols don't need bread. Yet, there were those who stayed, who refused to leave. The elderly, the faithful, the stubborn. They formed new patterns of life, smaller, slower. In their neighborhoods, people learned to store rainwater in jars. 2 dry bread crusts for reuse. 2 barter quietly. 2 avoid drawing attention. A new humility grew. Even the churches adapted. Bishops, increasingly powerful, began to fill the void left by civil officials. Some used church storehouses to distribute food. Not much, but enough to be noticed. Slowly, faith replaced function. Religion did what empire could not, but it came with a cost. The empire shrank not only in reach, but in purpose. Civic identity gave way to private faith. The common Roman, once a citizen of the world's mightiest state, now became a subject of God first and Rome second. The aqueducts still ran. The forums still stood, but the meaning had shifted. In one corner of the Palatine, a small inscription was carved by a mason around the year 401 CE. It read, "The grain has returned, but not the crowd. The oven is warm, but no one sings while kneading." That quiet detail, no singing, says more than any war chronicle. It captures the new Rome, the Rome of survival, not splendor. And what of the grain ships themselves? They continued for some time, though fewer and less regular. Eventually, even that lifeline frayed when Carthage fell to the Vandals in 439 CE. One of Rome's last major grain sources was lost. The supplies never fully resumed. Rome, once the mouth of an empire, came its stomachache. Later writers, like Procopius, would describe the city in the 6th century as a place of ruins haunted by memories. But even that was too poetic. More accurately, it became a city where food stopped being expected, where hunger was no longer a surprise, was a neighbor. The final blow did not come from starvation, but from forgetfulness. The systems failed. Quietly, not all at once. The records grew disorganized. Officials stopped issuing full reports. Warehouses fell out of repair. When a new prefect was appointed, he found entire ledgers blank. Not because of conspiracy, not even corruption. It's just erosion, one slow hour at a time. A clerk misplaced a record. Port scribe retired, and no one replaced him. A stone broke on the dock and was never reset. A statue honoring Unknowna, goddess of grain, fell in a storm and was left in the mud. That is how a system dies. Case, not with collapse, with disinterest. In the end, Rome did not starve into oblivion, survived, but the hunger became part of it like a scar, and long after the ships stopped sailing, people still looked toward the sea, wondering, was it ever the empire at all or just the promise of another ship? He woke before dawn, not from duty, but from habit. The cold stones beneath his straw bedding offered little comfort, but he did not complain. There was no one to complain to. This was the outer frontier of the Roman Empire, a lonely watchtower at the edge of the Danube. The river was quiet, now frozen. In fact, a wide silver vein slicing through frost-bitten fields. Beyond it, the forests of the Germanic tribes waited silently, their bare trees like spears pointing skyward. The soldier's name was Titus Flavius Crito. He was not a centurion or a man of glory. He was not paid to be bold. He was a rank canfile guard stationed at Castra Vindex, a crumbling border fortification in the province of Mysia Inferior. His post was once important, one of many that kept the empire's enemies at bay. But the empire had stopped sending enemies, or allies, or anything at all. The outpost had once held 60 men. Now, only 7 remained. The last cohort had been pulled south 2 winters ago, reassigned to Gaulor, so they were told. They'd left with wagons and armor, promising fresh orders would follow. They didn't. What did follow was silence. At first, the remaining men waited. They trained, teed, they cleaned their spears, They shaved daily, kept their tunics tidy, and raised the Roman standard every morning. But eventually, the standards began to sag. The blades dulled. The drills shortened. There was no one to inspect them. Crito had been a soldier for 18 years, long enough to know that a forgotten post was a dangerous post. Not dangerous because of enemies, but because of time. Time eroded purpose. And purpose was the only thing holding these walls up. The fort's walls, built by better hands long ago, still stood. But weeds had crept through the stonework. The gate creaked at night. The armory held more dust than arrows. Crito still performed his rounds, not out of duty, but out of rhythm. He walked the perimeter 3 times each day. He counted his steps. He checked the wooden slats for rot. He nodded to the others, mostly silent now, who still lingered in the barracks. They had become ghosts. In uniform, occasionally, villagers from nearby settlements would bring eggs or barley in exchange for salt or cloth. These exchanges had once been strictly regulated. Now, there were gestures, informal, unrecorded. One villager, an old man with a twisted foot, would often sit near the outer wall and talk to Crito about weather, birds, and once about a dream he'd had that Rome was a statue with no feet. Crito never laughed. He just listened. He had learned to speak less. In the absence of orders, silence became its own discipline. There were rumors, passed from one tired mouth to another, that the empire was crumbling, that barbarians had crossed the Rhine, that cities were falling, that emperors changed faster than the seasons. But Crito had heard these before. Every frontier soldier had. It was the rhythm of empire disaster from a distance. Still, something had changed. The last supply shipment had come 3 years ago. 1 donkey cart, manned by a boy. The olive oil had spoiled. The dried fruit was eaten in a single afternoon. There had been no coin, no scroll, no fresh sandals, just a tired wave from the boy. As he turned around after that, nothing. The men pulled what they had. They rationed. They patched their own cloaks. They forged arrowheads from broken hinges. They joked that the empire had become an idea, not a government, a flag waving in the wind with no hand behind it. And yet, Credo stayed. He stayed through winters when the wind bit through the walls, through summers when the sun boiled the metal armor left hanging too long. He stayed even when the others started leaving one by one, disappearing into the forests, into villages, into silence. Of the 7 who had remained, only 3 were now left. 1 had died of fever. 1 simply wandered off. Mond slit his own throat after whispering prayers to forgotten gods. His blood stained the prayer stone beside the latrine. No one cleaned it, and yet Creto stayed. Why? Because Rome had once promised him meaning, a place, a role, a set of routines that elevated a simple man into something more. Even as the empire forgot him, he remembered it. He cleaned his armor once a week, even if he never wore it. He wrote letters to a family he had long stopped hearing from. He sharpened blades no one else used, sometimes, at night. He practiced formation, drills alone, marching in the dust, with perfect turns, hearing in his mind the phantom voices of forgotten commanders. Other times, he stood atop the wall and stared out across the river. The forest beyond glowed silver under moonlight. Once, he saw torches flickering far in the trees, watching, passing. It didn't matter. He made no alarm. We just watched, and they passed. He still lit the watch beacon each dusk, though he doubted anyone saw it. The empire had become too large, too stretched, too tired to look in his direction. One morning, Credo awoke to find that the last of his comrades had vanished. No note, no sound, just absence. Their bedroll was folded, their armor left behind, gone. He sat with that silence for an entire day. Then he cleaned the empty bunk. Now he was alone, just him, the walls, and the idea of Rome. He still patrolled. He still lit the torch. He still raised the standard. And one cold evening, as a storm rolled down from the north, he whispered aloud the oath he had taken 2 decades earlier. I swear, by Jupiter, Achilles, Mars, and all the gods of Rome, to defend the empire, to obey its laws, and to hold my post. No one heard him. He said it anyway, because when there are no more orders, sometimes the man becomes the wall. And still, the question echoes through those lonely corridors of stone. If no one commands, but the guard still stands, is the empire truly gone? Asterix, the wind changed first. It came from the north, as it often did in that season. But this wind was different. It carried the scent of smoke not from hearth fires or village kitchens, but from forests set alight far beyond the frontier. A warning, whispered through pine and frost. But the empire no longer listened to whispers. Titus Flavius Creto smelled it before he saw anything. He stepped onto the upper wall walk at dawn, wrapped in his worn cloak, and scanned the horizon like he had for years. In the far distance, smoke curled lazily into the sky, too thin for war, too thick for a campfire. Creto stared at it until the sun rose fully. Then he went back inside. He said nothing. He sharpened the blade that would likely never be drawn. By then, it had been 3 weeks since the last soldier disappeared. Credo hadn't tried to find him. There was no point. Men left. That was the only direction they moved now. But Creto did one thing differently that morning. He put on his full armor. He hadn't worn the complete set in months. It took time, but the straps were stiff. The mail rusted in places. His fingers were slower, but he fastened every piece, tied his belt, secured his dagger, adjusted the helmet. He stood before a polished copper dish hung on the barracks, while a makeshift mirror hand stared at himself. He looked Roman, but he didn't feel it. There was no audience for his service, no trumpet, no roll call, just the slow creak of the gate and the sigh of the wind. Still, he opened the gate. Crito walked into the field beyond the fort, where the grass reached his knees. He followed the trail once used by patrols, now barely visible. He walked for a mile, 2, 3. He reached the ridge that overlooked the river. The Danube shimmered in the morning light. Across it, the forest was quiet. No movement, no enemy, no allies, just trees. He waited. He wasn't expecting anyone, but part of him still clung to the idea that anyone might come. It's a messenger, a fellow guard, a scout, a barbarian, a wolf, but no one did. The uniform weighed heavier than it once had, not because of age, but because of its irrelevance. A Roman soldier, lone, unacknowledged, still wearing the full kit of a forgotten empire, guarding a fort no longer listed in anyone's ledgers. He returned by afternoon, fed himself with half a stale biscuit, drank water from the cistern, repaired a sandal strap, routine, even now. Later that evening, the old villager came again, the man with the twisted foot. He hobbled to the gate and sat under the torchlight, looking up at Crito with watery eyes. "You still wear it?" the old man asked, nodding at the armor. Crito didn't answer at first. Then, "Yes." "Why?" Crito said. "Because the fort still stands." The old man gave a slow nod, but his face was unreadable. "And if it falls?" Crito looked out beyond the walls, into the dusk. The wind had carried the smoke away. Just silence. "Then I will stand with it," he replied. The old man smiled faintly, as if he understood or perhaps pitied the sentiment. He left a small sack of dried beans at the gate and hobbled away. That night, the torch went out, and when Crito didn't bother relighting it, in his quarters, he found an old wooden box beneath his cot. Inside were relics, a letter from his sister in Ravenna, yellowed with age, a bronze token from a bathhouse in Nicomedia, a piece of charcoal drawing done by a child in a distant camp, once handed to him for protection. He sat with them a long time. Rome, he realized, had always been an idea more than a place. But ideas had weight. They took shape in bricks, in shields, in habits, and in uniforms. The next day, the smoke returned closer this time, but again, no army followed it. Just the dark trail of something burning. A farm, perhaps. A barn. Another forgotten village. Crito watched. He wrote nothing down. At twilight, Height took off the armor, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The uniform was no longer a symbol. Not here, not now, not alone. He folded it neatly, placed it in the footlocker, covered it with a cloth. That evening, he stood at the wall without armor for the first time in years. It's just a man. It's bones and breath and memory. He watched the trees, again, as he always had. But now, the question was quieter and more honest. If a soldier stands when no one watches and no war ever comes, was he guarding anything at all? Asterisk, it was not an invasion that ended his watch. It was a morning like any other. The fog had rolled in thick from the river. The stones of the fort walls were wet, shining like bone. Titus Flavius Crito, once a soldier of the empire, stood where he always stood along the rampart, looking east, watching for a signal that had not come in 5 years. He was no longer young. The lines in his face had deepened like weathered script carved into old marble. His hands ached in the cold. His back had stiffened from years of sleeping on straw. And still he moved with the rhythm of duty, no longer from hope, but from memory. The birds nested in the towers now. Small things lived where banners once flew. The empire had receded so slowly from his life that it never felt like collapse. It felt like weather. Each year, one less thing arrived. One fewer face, one forgotten name, one unstamped letter, till all that was left was wind and stone. Credo kept the gates closed, though no one approached them. He still oiled the hinges, still swept the stones, still pulled weeds from the path to the latrines. He was the caretaker of a place no one remembered. And then, on one uneventful morning, he made a choice. He sat at the edge of the wall and looked down at the path that led to the forest. It was overgrown now, swallowed by shrubs and time. The trail he once patrolled with a dozen others was now barely visibly. Thread of crushed grass and faint footprints. He packed a satchel, a cloak, a rusted dagger, some dried beans, a tiny ceramic jug of sorrel wine. In the drawing from the child in Nicomedia, he did not put on the uniform. Asterisk, he left the gate unlocked. He stepped into the mist alone, not because of fear or defeat, but because the silence had become too complete. Not far from the fort, he paused, turned, looked at the outline of the wall gray against gray, familiar as his own hands. He wondered, would anyone ever see it again? Would a traveler stumble upon the ruins? Would some future scholar brush dust from a stone and ask who had stood here, alone, for years? Would they understand that the end of the Roman Empire didn't always come with fire or invasion, but with a man like him, quietly folding his uniform, locking the storeroom, and walking away? 1,000 miles west, a senator might give a speech. In Constantinople, a scribe might draw a new boundary on a map. In Gaul, a general might defect. But here, the empire ended, not with rebellion or siege. It ended when the last soldier simply stopped standing guard. Creto followed the old trail southward, walking without urgency. He passed a ruined shrine to Mithras, covered in moss, a broken wagon wheel half buried in loam, the skeleton of a goat. At dusk, he reached a bend in the path that overlooked the valley. Smoke curled from a small village below. He recognized it from years ago. The one where the twisted-footed old man had once brought him beans. He stood for a long time, watching the firelight blink in the windows of thatch-roofed homes. He did not go down. Not yet. Not that night. Instead, he found shelter beneath a cedar tree, wrapped himself in his cloak, and rested his head against his pack. Above him, stars were sharp and cold. The wind moved through the grass in waves. He slept. He dreamt of water clear and endless flowing through old aqueducts that stretched into the clouds. He dreamt of horns in the distance, banners still flapping, in cities lit with oil lamps. He dreamt of being seen, but when he woke, there was only dew, and the soft hum of life going on. Years later, long after the village had been abandoned, long after the forest overtook the old Roman roads a group of monks passed through, they found the ruins of Castra Vindex. They saw the fallen tower, the empty gate. Inside, they found a wooden chest. Inside that chest, a folded uniform, untouched, wrapped in cloth, and a token with the name Titus Flavius Creto scratched into its surface. No inscription, no final message, just the shape of a life left behind. They lit a candle, whispered a prayer, and left it there. And so, in the end, what did the fort guard? A man, a memory, an idea, and perhaps that was Rome all along. Can an empire still live in silence as long as someone remembers the weight of its armor? It's asterisk in the middle of the 3rd century CE. If you had a denarius in your pocket, it told a lie. The coin was Roman. Yes, it bore the emperor's face. It had Latin inscriptions, cleanly pressed from official dies. It was round, weighty, respectable, but it wasn't what it used to be. Not anymore. This was the moment when Roman currency began to dissolve not in sight, but in substance. And with it, the financial core of an empire unraveled quietly, coin by coin. The early Roman Republic had been fanatical about purity. Their Silver coins. Silver coins especially, the denarius, were reliable, 95 to 98% pure, trustworthy. They shimmered with confidence. A Roman could travel from Londinium to Jerusalem and know his currency held its value. But the empire grew, and with it came new needs. Soldiers needed payment. Walls needed building. Roads needed repairs. Bureaucrats needed salaries. Provinces needed bribes. And emperors, many of them needed to stay in power. So the empire started minting more money, not by increasing wealth, but by decreasing integrity. It started subtly. Under Emperor Nero, in the 1st century, the denarius was debased to about 90% silver. Most citizens never noticed. Looked the same, weighed nearly the same. But beneath the surface, a precedent had been set. By the time of Septimius Severus, a century later, the silver content had dropped below 50%. People began to notice. The coins tarnished faster. They felt light. Some began to bend. They no longer rang when dropped on marble. Merchants bit them with their teeth. The government tried to hide it. New coins were shiny with silver-washed thin coatings that made them gleam. But when that sheen wore off, a dull core revealed itself. A cheap truth and a beautiful lie. Rome had become a forger of itself. At the heart of this crisis was inflation. Sudden, but creeping. Prices rose in the markets. One loaf of bread that had cost 1 denarius now cost 2. Soldiers, disgruntled by the devalued coins, demanded more pay. Emperors obliged raising wages, but not fixing the money. And the mint kept running. The mint in Rome, the mint in Antioch, the mint in Alexandria. Each one pressing promises into metal, each one minting the future into fragility. You were standing in a Roman workshop now, in the back alleys near the Forum, around 260 CE. A man is counting coins in a clay bowl. He's a merchant, once wealthy, now nervous. He pays a tax collector. In a stack of Antoninianus coins, there's silver content, barely 20%. The collector, seeing the pile, sneers. "These aren't coins," he mutters. "They're painted rust," but he takes them. He has no choice. This is how the empire paid its debts, with shadows of value. In the provinces, things were worse. Traders stopped accepting Roman currency altogether. Some demanded raw silver, others switched to barter. In Gaul, certain towns began issuing their own coinage, unofficial but more stable. The imperial seal no longer guaranteed anything. Top people hoarded the old coins, the denarii of Augustus, Tiberius, Vespasian. Solid, heavy, meaningful. They were hidden in jars, buried in walls, kept under floorboards, not spent, just remembered, and what's left for daily life. The river of bad coins-based metals with silver dust, exchanged with a wind start. By the mid-3rd century, entire regions stopped trusting Roman currency. The army, Rome's pride and power, began demanding payment in kind. Food, land, direct goods. They no longer trusted the coin. The legionaries didn't believe in the empire's money. What was left? And then came the worst insult. In 274 CE, Emperor Aurelian introduced a new coin called the Aurelianus. He tried to restore faith. He set it with a fixed silver content and strict regulations. But the damage was done. Merchants laughed. Citizens clung to the old coins. The mint tried harder, struck faster. But the economy was no longer a matter of money. It was a matter of belief. Currency is trust. And Rome had spent too much of it. And where did all the silver go? To the army, to buy loyalty, to fund campaigns, to keep rival generals at bay. Each usurper needed coins to prove legitimacy. Each civil war drained the treasury. Quita, victory, had to be minted before it could be claimed. The treasury in Rome, once the envy of the ancient world, was reduced to clever accounting. Debts were paid in promises. Temples were looted. Statues melted, cold, stripped from rooftops, and refashioned into bribes. Inscriptions from the period speak volumes. One merchant in Ostia carved into a wall, "A pound of wheat costs 15 denarii, a donkey 2,000. The gods weep for the weight of empty purses." Another inscription, more quietly, simply read, "Even lies grow lighter over time." That was the Roman coin in the 3rd century, a lie that weighed less with each passing year, and the people adapted. They always do. Markets began listing prices in multiple forms: coin, barter, labor. Bakers demanded cloth in exchange for loaves. Shoemakers accepted olives. Housewives learned to weigh coins with their own hands, feeling for deception. Even grave robbers began targeting older tombs not for relics, but for the pre-debasement coins buried with the dead. So much silver, hidden underground, while the living scraped by on slivers. The rich, as always, were less affected. They had land, villas, grain stores, influence. They paid in favors. They kept real wealth tucked in urns and jewelry boxes. The poor carried baskets of cheap coins that meant less with every step, and yet the system endured. Somehow, until one day, a man stood in the Roman Forum, held up a coin, and asked, "If Caesar's head is still here, why is nothing else?" And no one had an answer. The coins still bore the empire's image, but the empire they described had already vanished bit by bit, just like the silver. If value disappears slowly enough, when do we notice it's gone? It's asterisk. If you walked into the Roman treasury by the end of the 3rd century, you might not see piles of gleaming silver or neatly stacked coins. You'd see ledgers, scrolls, a tangle of inked numbers written by men who were no longer confident in what they were counting. The empire had become rich in accounting, but poor in wealth. The real crisis wasn't just the debasement of the coin, it was the breakdown of Rome's ability to understand its own economy. Taxation, once a disciplined science, had become guesswork. Estimates replaced ledgers. Guesstimates replaced estimates. Then came lies. At the heart of it was the census. The Roman census was once a marveling, orderly listing of all citizens, their families, their properties, and their obligations to the state. It was conducted regularly during the Republic and early Empire. But as the empire grew bloated and chaotic, the census broke down, stopped reaching the edges. Entire provinces were undercounted or not counted at all. Some areas, especially in the east, evaded the census for decades. Then no one followed up. Others reported phantom households to reduce their tax burden or inflate their population for prestige. The government, desperate for income, accepted even faulty numbers if it meant coins in the coffers. And then, even those coins weren't enough, so the state invented a fiction. Fixed tax quotas. Asterisk. Instead of recalculating what each town owed based on current realities, Rome simply assigned static figures per region, per village, per year. If your village had once paid 1,000 denarii in taxes, it was expected to continue doing so, regardless of droughts, famines, invasions, or loss of population. Rome had created a tax system that assumed nothing ever changed. It's even as everything did. Local magistrates, unable to meet these quotas, had to make up the difference themselves. Many went bankrupt. Others fled. A few turned tyrannical, squeezing their own people for every last coin. In Egypt, some village scribes recorded their own suicide notes into tax ledgers. "I cannot demand from those who have nothing, and so I leave the table and its numbers behind." The imperial court, far removed from these villages, issued more edicts, higher taxes, new levies on goods, on services, on movement. A man crossing from one district to another might be taxed for his sandals. A farmer might be fined for owning too many tools. A miller charged for using river water. Even professions were taxed. Bakers, smiths, potters, all recorded and bound to their trades. Forbidden to leave them, taxed regardless of profit. Rome wasn't just taxing its people, it was trapping them. And the coins, still worthless, still small lies wrapped in state. Legitimacy. Inflation surged. A pound of pork cost 1,000 denarii in some places. A single cloak could be worth as much as a soldier's annual pay. Soldiers, furious, began demanding land instead of currency. They wanted something that didn't rust or evaporate. But the land was already pledged, given to senators. 2 elites, 2 allies, or simply stolen. So the emperors turned to a final tool: forced labor. Citizens were invited to contribute to imperial building projects, to grain collection, to road repair, not for pay, but for duty. The state had run out of ways to reward loyalty, so it replaced reward with expectation. And still, the state grew heavier by the time of Diocletian's rise in 284 CE. The empire had 2 truths. It could no longer afford to pay itself. It could not afford to stop trying. Diocletian saw the mess clearly. He was no fool. He enacted reforms, some of the most sweeping in Roman history. He tried to reset the tax system, introduced new coinage, divided the empire for easier management, even tried to fix prices by law. His edict on maximum prices, 3-1 CE, was nailed in marketplaces across the empire. It listed the maximum legal price for everything from wheat to slaves to barber services. Anyone who charged more could be executed. The idea was noble. The result was chaos. Merchants stopped selling. Markets went quiet. Barter exploded. Edict was largely ignored or feared. Diocletian's intentions couldn't reverse centuries of collapse. You can still find fragments of the edict, chiseled into ruined walls across the Mediterranean. One reads, "The price of a shoemaker's labor, 20 denarii." But by then, no one paid in denarii. They paid in bread, in linen, in silence. And what of the treasury? The great temple to Rome's financial power. It became a museum of promises. Tall shelves of scrolls documenting debts that could never be collected. Documents of requisition orders, never fulfilled. Coin molds gathering dust. The silver was gone. The gold was hidden. The books remained open, legible, and useless. In the countryside, peasants coined their own solutions. Literally, clay tokens, carved stones, pieces of broken pottery, marked with symbols, used as placeholders for value. It wasn't legal. It wasn't orderly. But it worked. The empire had become 2 systems. One official, broken and hollow. The other unofficial, quiet and functional. And in this duality, something snapped. The people stopped expecting help from Rome. They stopped sending petitions, stopped traveling to cities to resolve disputes. Local lords rose. Fortified estates multiplied. Power fragmented into 1,000 pieces. A senator in Rome could still commission a mosaic. A farmer in Thrace just wanted flour that wouldn't cost a horse. And in this mosaic of desperation, a question passed from lip to lip. If an empire cannot feed, pay, or count its people, is it still ruling them? Asterisk, by the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was still enormous, at least on parchment. Maps, inked in purple and gold, still showed its borders stretching from the wind-swept highlands of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. Scrolls still spoke of dominion, legacy, of endless grain, legions, and wealth. But the wealth had gone quiet, not vanished, but hidden, hoarded, frozen. The state still demanded taxes, still printed coin, still etched laws into stone. But what it could no longer do, what it had forgotten how to do, was move its own money where it was most needed. Wealth was there. It no longer flowed. Picture a provincial town in España once. vibrant with trade, its roads now cracked, its granary closed, its marketplace hushed, except on feast days. The local decurion, the town's tax official, is surrounded by scrolls, owing levies to the imperial government that haven't changed in 20 years. But half the town is gone. Fields lie fallow. Workshops are silent. The coins he collects are tinny, corroded, rejected by merchants. He can't meet the quota, but the empire still expects it, so he pays the difference himself. And so do many like him. Small town elites across the empire, forced by law to subsidize the imperial treasury from their personal fortunes. Some do so out of loyalty, most do it out of fear, but soon they stop, they flee, or bribe their way out, or vanish, one by one. People who once maintained the empire's budget from below begin to disappear. And that's when Rome turns inward, the imperial court, realizing it can no longer rely on these local structures, begins centralizing everything. A new bureaucracy blooms, massive, intricate, paper-thin. Officials multiply. Titles stretch across pages. Inspectors inspect inspectors. And everyone is taxed to support the inspectors. But this creates a paradox. The state needs money to pay its administrators. But the administrators are the only ones left who can collect money, so the state begins to consume itself. Gold is requisitioned from temples, melted down and stored in guarded treasuries. Land is seized and redistributed to soldiers, to bishops, to allies. Imperial estates, vast swaths of farmland, once meant to feed cities, are leased at impossible rates. Peasants locked into these lands become less like citizens and more like serfs. The economy doesn't collapse, it calcifies, like a river that's no longer allowed to flood. Even the coinage loses meaning by the time of Constantine. New coins. I introduced the solidus, a beautiful gold coin, more stable than anything since Augustus. It becomes the new standard. But it is hoarded. The rich bury it in vaults, in amphitheater, in church foundations. They do not spend it. They do not invest it. They sit atop it like dragons. The poor, meanwhile, deal in the old, debased coinager in goods, barter, salt, tools, bread. The rich and poor no longer use the same economy. They no longer speak the same economic language. The state tries to force the issue. Laws are passed requiring professions to remain hereditary. If your father was a baker, you must be one too. If your father paid taxes, you will too. Even if the workshop is now rubble and the road to market is gone, you cannot move. You cannot escape. You cannot rise. The economy is no longer a system, is a prison, and yet the illusion is maintained. The emperor still holds court in gleaming palaces. Imperial decrees still reference the greatness of Rome. Coins still bear the heads of divine rulers. But the people live in a world where silver means nothing, where wealth cannot be moved, where grain is worth more than gold. In North Africa, a merchant writes, "I have coins, I have titles, I have rights, but I cannot trade for bread." In Gaul, a bishop records, "The empire taxes us as if it were rich, feeds us as if it were poor, and speaks to us as if we are still loyal." And in Rome itself, the senators grow quiet. Many retreat to their country estates, fortified, guarded. They no longer serve the state, they serve themselves. The Senate, once the brain of the empire, becomes a ceremonial mouth. It says the words, "Go," but the words go nowhere. The imperial budget, in its final form, becomes a ghost, a list of obligations that can't be fulfilled, a ledger of expenses that no longer buy anything, a map of a world that no longer exists. And yet, to the very end, the paperwork continues. Scribes still ink numbers. Tax quotas are still revised. Currency is still minted. Scrolls are still filed. Decrees still sent. Rome never stopped pretending it was wealthy. Because if it admitted the truth that its budget was a fiction, its wealth untouchable, its economy split in two, then the illusion of empire would fall with it. And maybe that's why the empire truly collapsed. Not because it lost a war or a city or a province, but because it forgot how to spend what it still owned. And we're left to wonder if an empire keeps printing money, issuing laws, and collecting taxes, but none of it feeds the people. Was it ever truly rich at all? Asterisk, the wall was not built in panic. It was built in confidence, stretching like a great scar across the northern reaches of Britannia. Hadrian's Wall was Rome's stone promise that civilization had a boundary, and that Rome alone would define it. It stood not merely as defense, but as message. A message chiseled into every watchtower, every fortified gate, every shovel of gravel packed between those towering layers of stone. Beyond this, there is nothing but wilderness. Behind this, there is Rome. And for a while, it worked. Hadrian's Wall was begun in 122 CE under the watchful direction of the emperor whose name it bears. He visited the frontier himself. He walked the wind-scoured hills, spoke with generals, consulted engineers. He saw the boundary not just as geography, but as governance. Asterisk. It would run from sea to sea, coast to coast, across the narrowest part of northern Britannia, 80 Roman miles long. About 73 modern miles, but longer in burden, built not to enclose, but to divide, to separate Roman from Briton, taxpayer from raider, rule from rebellion. At first, the wall pulsed with purpose, garrisoned with thousands of legionaries, bristling with towers and gates. Civilians flocked to its shadow traders, smiths, farmers, families. Forts became towns. Towns grew into hubs of Roman culture, surrounded by pubs, bathhouses, and shrines. Latin rang out over the moors. This wasn't a wall to retreat behind. It was a wall to project from. You were standing on the wall now, in the late 2nd century. Below, a column of merchants approaches the checkpoint at Vindolanda. A tax collector records goods, wool, tin, salted pork. Nearby, a patrol sharpens their spears in the shade of the barracks. On the other side, beyond the north gate, there's heather and mist and silence. The wild Rome could not rule the wild, so it fenced it. But fences change over time, especially when the hands that built them grow tired. By the 3rd century, the wall had begun to shift in meaning. It still stood, mostly. Sections were repaired, others neglected. Stone blocks were reused by locals. Forts lost their fresh paint. Latin inscriptions faded in rain. The empire, stretched thinner each year, had less to send fewer soldiers, fewer supplies. Officers once rotated from across the empire. Now they stayed, or were replaced by local recruits, Britons trained in Roman ways, but less loyal to Rome's center. The wall, once a sharp border, became a soft edge. Trade still flowed across it, but less officially. Tribes paid tribute. Governors turned a blind eye. A cattle thief one year might be a hired auxiliary the next. The line blurred. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire had begun to split, not just administratively, but mentally. The West grew, weaker. Britain, more isolated. Emperors were crowned in Gaul, not in Rome. Legions were recalled to fight civil wars on the continent. Gaps in the wall opened like missing teeth. And then came the silences. In 367 CE, the wall went dark. For weeks, no signal fires lit the watchtowers. Couriers went unanswered. And then came the raiders. A coordinated assault known as the Barbarian Conspiracy hit the Roman defenses in Britain. The Picts from the north, the Scotti from across the sea, the Saxons from the east. Hadrian's wall, proud and tall and ancient, was overrun. Some forts resisted, some surrendered, others were simply bypassed. The line drawn in stone had become a suggestion in Rome. the crisis was barely acknowledged. The emperor had more pressing concerns: revolts in Africa, invasions in Illyria, rumors of treachery in the court. A fleet was sent to restore order. Some garrisons were rebuilt, but it was no longer about permanence. It was about appearances. The wall would be maintained, but not because it protected, because it symbolized what Rome still claimed to be. A few decades later, in 410 CE, the Emperor Honorius sent a message to the cities of Britain. It read, simply, "You must look to your own defenses now." The line was official. The meaning was final. Rome had abandoned the wall, and the wall had become a fence. Not for keeping others out, but for keeping Romans in. Because what was once the frontier of an empire had become a prison of the imagination, a place where people still spoke Latin, still prayed to Roman gods or Roman saints, still used Roman coin, still carved Roman letters into tombstones, but no longer lived in Rome. They lived in its shadow, in the echo of its walls. Hadrian's Wall still stood, but it no longer divided order from chaos. It simply marked where the empire had once tried, in one abandoned tower. Archaeologists later found a child's wooden sword, carved roughly, burned at the tip, tucked beneath a fallen roof beam. A toy from a boy who had lived in the final days of the wall's purpose. We do not know his name. We do not know his fate. But we know what he left behind. A blade pointed northward, a world he never knew, guarded by a wall that had already stopped believing in itself. And we're left to ask, when does a wall stop protecting, start imprisoning those who built it? Text. The wall still stood, but not with certainty, after the empire's quiet withdrawal. In the early 5th century, Hadrian's Wall no longer functioned as a military barrier. It became something stranger, something Rome had not designed it to be. It became a ruin you could live inside. For the people left behind in Roman Britain, citizens, soldiers, merchants, farmers, the wall was no longer a symbol of protection. It was stone, useful, available. Some dismantled parts of it to build barns. Others lived in its towers. Its livestock grazed beside its battlements. And at night, under stars no longer watched by imperial eyes, families sat inside the forts and ate from clay bowls once stamped with the imperial eagle. The empire had left, the architecture remained, and in its place, something older returned: tribes, chiefs, local warlords, and the unrecorded lives of those who never truly cared about Rome, only about survival. But not all let go. Many Romanized Britons still clung to the illusion of empire. They held on to Latin, 2 baths, 2 painted frescoes, and scheduled meals. They called their new leaders dukes and counts, using old Roman titles. Some minted coins with ghostly imitations of imperial portraits. Others copied imperial decrees, word for word, changing only the names. This was not nostalgia. This was habit. Because for nearly 400 years, Rome had been more than a ruler. It had been a way of organizing time, space, and food. To be Roman wasn't to live in Italy, it was to believe in a system that made sense. Aqueducts ran, roads connected, judges heard cases, patrolled. Even when the empire was gone, people tried to reenact its movements. So Hadrian's Wall was no longer a border, it was a memory. And memories, like walls, decay unevenly. In some places, the forts became strongholds for local elites. In others, they became shelters for displaced families. Being still others, they were simply avoided: too large, too haunted, too full of the past. And all the while, across the water, new kind of visitor began to arrive. Not legions, migrants. The Saxons came first, settlers, not raiders. They were invited, in a way, hired to defend Romanized cities in the south against inland rebellion and northern chaos. They brought their language, their customs, throds. The Britons called them foederati, federated allies. But alliances shift within a generation. The Saxons no longer served. They ruled. The wall, once a line of defense against barbarians, now stood in a land where those very groups were landlords, kings, harmers. Rome had tried to hold the wilderness out. Now the wilderness had been invited in, and the wall watched. It happened stone by stone, silently. One retired Roman soldier, name unknown, left behind a scratched inscription inside a guardhouse. We built the wall to keep them out. Okay, but we built no wall against forgetting. It's not clear who he meant, the enemy, the Romans, himself. But the forgetting came, slowly. The Latin faded, the calendars broke, the aqueducts cracked. Children grew up not knowing why the roads were straight, or who had carved the letters above the gate, or why the stones fit so perfectly together. And yet Hadrian's wall did not vanish, even in its slow collapse. It remained the spine of the north. Merchants still used it to navigate. Travelers still marked their way by it. Even centuries later, medieval scribes recorded its shape in their maps, unsure of its origins, calling it Murus Pericularum, the wall of danger, the devil's fence. The memory of Roman order had become a kind of folklore, not history, myth. You can imagine the scene. A boy in a shepherd's tunic walks along the ridge. He follows the stones, finds a rusted hinge, a worn engraving. He asks his grandmother, who built this, okay? And she says, the men who came before the winter stayed too long, okay? The Romans had built a wall not to protect the empire, but to believe it could be protected. But no wall, no matter how long or thick, can keep out time. As the empire faded, the wall's purpose unraveled, not in battle, but in disuse. And yet, even in ruin, it shaped the land. It told the people where they were. It told them where Rome had been. And perhaps that was its final role, not as defense, but as a reminder that there had once been a line, okay? And that someone, somewhere, had tried to hold it. But if the people forget what the wall was for, does the wall remember us instead? Asterisk, the last Roman left the wall centuries ago, but the wall never left the land. Hadrian's wall no longer patrolled, no longer commanded, no longer feared, endured, not because anyone needed it, but because no one knew how to erase it. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, as languages changed, and maps were redrawn, the long gray spine across the north of Britain continued to whisper beneath the grass, not as a military boundary, but as a question. What does a wall become when the world forgets why it was built? You stand there now in a mild spring morning, perhaps 1,000 years after the fall. The stones are warm from the sun. Sheep graze. Nearby, a breeze stirs the heather. All around you are fragments of the old structure, half-buried towers, ditches filled with wildflowers, foundations tangled with roots. You run your fingers over the chisel marks left by Roman hands, still, sharp under centuries of wind. No soldiers, no banners, no empire, just evidence, asterisk. And even in its silence, the wall still organizes space. Roads still curve around it. Property lines still follow its ridges. Villages were built just beyond its reach. People still refer to it in conversation, north of the wall or below the line. It remains a memory embedded in the land. In the Middle Ages, people mined for stone. Churches were built with Roman bricks. Manor houses claimed towers as their cellars. Monks walked its length, reciting prayers in Latin, never quite knowing they walked the edge of a vanished world. And then, one day, something unusual happened. A scribe, perhaps in York, perhaps in Durham, found a piece of old parchment in a crumbling library. It was a Roman military log from the wall. It recorded the names of soldiers, their origins, their rations, their patrol routes, the time of sunrise, the number of shoes distributed that month. There was nothing heroic in it, just the machinery of daily life. But the scribe copied it. He preserved it because it told a story not of conquest, but of structure. Not of glory, but of order. The quiet, disciplined hum of an empire that no longer breathed. That's how the wall returned to consciousness, not as legend, but as paperwork. Archaeologists, centuries later, would find letters at Vindolanda, one of the forts along the wall. Thin wooden tablets with ink still legible. Notes between wives. Orders for more grain. Complaints about underwear. One soldier wrote, "I send you my greetings. I have no more oil. The socks you sent are thin. We'll need new ones before the winter." He signed his name. He added a blessing to the gods. Then he disappeared into history. These small records, forgotten scraps, became more powerful than any emperor's speech because they showed what the wall really was. Not a barrier, not a boast, but a routine, a place where people lived, ate, wrote letters, mended shoes, lit torches each night because someone told them it mattered. In the end, the fall of Rome didn't break the wall. It just broke its purpose, and without purpose, didn't collapse. It waited through plagues, wars, rain, and moss, waited through the collapse of memory and the birth of myth, waited until the world became curious again, until people came back not with weapons, but with notebooks. They measured, they mapped, they listened, and the wall, in its own way, spoke. It told a story of belief that lines drawn in stone could shape behavior, that systems could stretch across time, that even when power fled, form remained. The empire had died, but the idea of Rome had left footprints in the landscape, and the wall was one of its deepest. So what, in the end, did Hadrian's wall defend? Not just the empire's edge. It defended the illusion that boundaries could hold forever, that beyond this point, disorder stopped, that within these stones, the world was known, named, counted. But when the empire receded and no one came to patrol the towers, the wall became something else entirely. It became a question that endures even now, as hikers step over the stones, as grass grows in the cracks, as distant clouds move across the sky, no longer watched by sentries. What happens when the wall outlives the empire? Asterisk. There are taxes on land, taxes on goods, taxes on inheritance, salt, grain, clothing, and even windows. But in the final chapters of the Western Roman Empire, there was something more sinister, something quieter. A tax not written into law, but into daily life. A burden so constant that it became invisible. It was the tax on existence, the cost of breathing under a crumbling sky. His name was Emperor Diocletian, and while he was not the first to wring revenue from the poor, he may have perfected the art of empire-wide suffocation. His reign began in 284 CE, at a time when Rome was unsteady, bloated, and fracturing. Coinage was debased, the army overextended, the frontiers cracked, and the tax base evaporating. So he reorganized everything. Diocletian was not a dreamer. He was a clerk in armor, a ruler who valued order above all. He divided the empire into smaller administrative units. He installed layers of bureaucracy to better track citizens, professions, and payments. He expanded the census, not for fairness, but for extraction. He looked at a crumbling empire and asked, how can we make the pieces pay for their own decay? And so began a fiscal strategy that would haunt the empire for centuries, taxing the body. Every citizen, every household, every breathable corner of the empire was assessed not just for wealth, but for existence itself. At the core was a reform called the Capita, Tio-Iugatio. It sounds like a spell, but it was a calculation, cold and precise. The Eugatio measured land, how much soil you owned, how much you could farm, what you could produce. The capitatio measured people. How many bodies lived on that land? How many hands could labor? How many mouths required bread? And, together, they formed a fixed tax burden attached to both land and flesh. It didn't matter if the crop failed, or the river dried, or bandits stole your cattle. You still paid, because your existence was now an entry in the imperial ledger. A wheat farmer in Syria, shepherd in Illyria, a potter in Gaul. They all became numbers, assessed not just for what they did, but for what they might do. If you owned land, Rome assumed it was fertile. If you had sons, Rome assumed they could work. If you were alive, Rome assumed you could contribute. And if you couldn't, debt wasn't Rome's problem. People began to flee not across borders, but into invisibility. Entire families vanished from the census. Some joined monasteries, others moved to remote valleys. Still others sold themselves into bondage to escape taxation. A paradox emerged. Rome was taxing people so aggressively that it was shrinking the population it relied on. The state responded by locking people into place. A baker's son must be a baker. A shoemaker's daughter must stitch leather. A potter's grandson must turn clay. Not by tradition, but by imperial decree. Because if people could change professions, they could change their tax category, And Rome could not afford that movement. Became rebellion. Even breath became taxable. One Roman governor in North Africa famously remarked, "They say the wind is free, but every man must breathe it to labor. Therefore, it has value. Therefore, it must be weighed." He didn't literally tax the air, but he didn't need to. The empire had created a system in which being alive was enough to owe the state everything. You could not own a cow without declaring it. You could not mill flour without permission. You could not cut timber without being assessed. Even bees, in some provinces, were taxed by the hive. One surviving edict from the Diocletianic era, outlines 157 separate tax categories for a single district. Wool, ink, bricks, nets, sandals, grapes, slaves, rope, parchment, bread, lime, goats, mirrors, doors, feathers, fishhooks, and breath. Not on the scroll, but everywhere in life. People whispered about tax agents like spirits. Men who appeared suddenly, parchment in hand, questions on their tongues. Whose field is this? How many hours did your servant work? Who is the boy tending your goats? Every answer could cost you. Some farmers began to bury tools rather than report them. Others lied about their children's ages. Entire hamlets moved inland, deep into woods or cliffsides, just to exist between Rome's lines. And yet, the state believed itself righteous, because the army was hungry. The bureaucracy needed ink. The roads were still cracked. The provinces still stirred. Barbarians still knocked. And so the empire taxed. And taxed. And taxed until it taxed itself numb. A famous Roman satirist wrote, "A man may eat nothing, sleep nowhere, own nothing, and still wake up owing the emperor a silver coin. Because he exists." Diocletian stepped down in 305 CE, one of the few emperors to retire voluntarily. He retreated to his palace in Dalmatia and grew cabbages. When asked later why he wouldn't return to power, he said, "If you could see the vegetables I've grown, you wouldn't ask me to be emperor again." But the taxes he created outlived him. The capitatio persisted. The idea that people were taxable, not just for their work, but for their very being, was now baked into Roman thought. And long after Diocletian's statues crumbled, long after his coins rusted, the empire still counted its people as burdens before it counted them as citizens, and we're left to wonder if a government must tax every breath to survive. Is it still ruling, or merely holding on? Asterisk by the mid-4th century. Rome had perfected the art of accounting, but forgotten the meaning of value. The imperial ledger was now thicker than any law code, and more powerful than any general's command. In it were the names of taxpayers, their obligations, their land plots, their livestock, their occupations their inherited trades, frozen across generations like fossils trapped in wax. But the system didn't reflect life. It replaced it. The Capita Sugio was no longer just a tax reform, it was a worldview, a logic so thorough it couldn't be argued with. If the ledger said you owed something, you did, even if the land was flooded, even if your sons had died in war, even if the ox you needed for plowing had broken its leg 2 winters ago and no replacement could be found, because the ledger never accounted for grief. In Antioch, Baker was arrested for failing to meet his flour quota. He had no grain. A blight had ruined the harvest. His neighbors testified on his behalf. The city clerk checked the register and shook his head. The blight is not recorded, he said. Therefore, it did not occur. The baker was fined, jailed, and replaced, asterisk, because the quota mattered more than the field in Gaul. Tax inspectors arrived in a village and found only women and children. The men had fled and asked who would pay the capitatio for the missing husbands. The village elder simply said, "We will pay in silence." The silence was not accepted as currency. The women were required to take up the labor, and when they could not, their livestock were seized. The law still spoke of justice, but the ledgers spoke louder. Even religion bowed too. The numbers, bishops, newly powerful as Rome transitioned into Christian rule, were not exempt. Church lands were assessed. Clergy were asked to register congregants for tax. A poor man might find himself on 2 lists, one for baptism and one for tribute. Some began to avoid both. It was said that the census taker knew more about you than your confessor. But it wasn't just individuals who suffered. Cities themselves began to fray under the weight of their assessments. In North Africa, the once bustling port city of Thraka fell into decline, not because of war, but because of paperwork. The town had been given a fixed grain quota decades earlier, based on population and output during a time of prosperity. But storms had changed the coastline. Trade shifted. The harbor silted. Merchants stopped arriving. Yet, the quota remained. The city council could not pay. The imperial administrators refused to adjust. Over the next 15 years, half the population fled. The rest lived in shadow. Rome never changed the numbers. The problem wasn't evil. It was rigidity. The empire had built a system too large to bend. Flexibility had become a liability. If one town was granted leniency, others would demand it. If one province's assessment was lowered, another would be asked to carry the weight. And so the machine kept moving forward, even as the ground beneath it crumbled. At its center was the scrinium, the great archive of taxation, maintained by clerks who never saw the fields they recorded. They sat in cool stone offices, scratching ink onto papyrus, calculating down to the handful of barley, the strand of wool, the length of rope. They did not mean harm. They simply believed the numbers. Theirs, an old Roman saying from this time, half serious, half afraid. A soldier may forget your name. The tax scroll never does. Even the army began to chafe under the weight of this system. Soldiers returned from campaigns to find their families impoverished by overdue assessments. Some were expected to pay tax on the land they'd been fighting to defend. One veteran wrote to a provincial magistrate, "I shed blood for the border. Now I shed coin for the field. If I had known Rome required both, I would have chosen neither." But protest was rare. The punishment for tax evasion was swift. Seizure of property, imprisonment, forced labor, or worse designation as a fugitivus, a runaway from the state, branded hunted, unprotected, and so people complied not out of loyalty, but out of exhaustion. They stayed in their trades. Okay. They registered their tools. Okay. They taught their children to be silent, and Rome mistook this silence for consent. One curious byproduct of all this was that wealth no longer meant freedom. A wealthy merchant in the 2nd century could buy land, change cities, elevate his status. But in the 4th century, wealth painted a target. The more you had, the more you owed. The richer you appeared, the more the state expected from you. This led to a strange irony. The richest citizens began hiding their riches. They buried coins, faked losses, bribed inspectors, or, in many cases, abandoned their estates entirely. Large villas in Gaul and Hispania were found in later centuries perfectly preserved. Their mosaics intact, their wine jars sealed, their tables set. No invasion, no fire, just quiet abandonment. The owners had vanished to escape the ledger, and still the scrolls remained, unrolling, calculating, assessing, because the empire believed that it could govern by arithmetic. And, for a time, it did. But what it didn't realize was that its people had stopped playing the game. They lived between the margins. They bartered. They concealed. They disappeared, and in doing so, they made the numbers meaningless. The ledger grew heavier. The empire grew lighter, until one day there were more pages than people, and we're left to ask if a government knows how to measure everything, forgets how to listen to anyone. What exactly is it governing? Asterisk by the final years of the Western Roman Empire. The tax system had become like the bones of a long-dead beast, still rigid, still holding shape, but empty of life. The scrolls still unfurled, the ledgers still whispered. But there were fewer names to record, fewer fields to assess, fewer hands to carry the burden. And yet the system kept operating out of habit, out of inertia, out of fear. Imagine a village in the hills of Pannonia, once prosperous, now half silent. Its population has shrunk, its fields lie fallow. The old Roman road that once connected it to the market town has crumbled, overgrown with grass. A tax collector still arrives once a year on a mule. He carries no soldiers, no entourage, just scrolls. He walks among empty houses, notes the orchards that no longer bear fruit, taps on doors that no longer open, and when he returns to his superior, he simply reports assessment unchanged, because changing the numbers would be more dangerous than ignoring the truth. The empire had become a fiction propped up by paperwork. Even in the capital, senators met under marble arches and pretended. The provinces still obeyed. Coins were minted with the emperor's image, though the emperor ruled only in name. Cana and only a sliver of land around Ravenna. The bureaucracy, ironically, was the last thing to fall. Letters still traveled between tax offices. Instructions were still copied. But those receiving them no longer had the tools or the people to act. Specters were dispatched to collect tribute from villages that no longer existed. Enforcers rode to enforce decrees upon people who had moved on. Changed names were slipped into forests beyond Roman reach. And so the empire began taxing ghosts. One such account survives in a fragment from southern Gaul, circa 470 CE. It's a complaint filed by a regional official. I have assessed the grain yield as ordered, but there are no fields. The lands have been absorbed by the river. The men who once farmed here are ash. Their sons fled. Await your reply. There was no reply that another region. A priest wrote. They come asking for silver. I show them the church roof leaking. They mark it on a scroll and leave. A month later, a second man arrives. He asks the same questions. Neither seems to know of the other. The system was cannibalizing its self-duplicating offices, sending contradictory orders, taxing the same person twice, 3 times. sometimes in the same week. And what of resistance? It didn't come as rebellion. The people were too tired for that. Instead, it came as a withdrawal from cities, from roads, from names. People stopped registering births. They didn't record marriages. They moved without notice. They buried tools to hide wealth. They joined bandits or monks, so converted land into sacred ground to avoid taxation, claiming their gardens were cemeteries, their fields consecrated. Some just stopped answering the door, and so the empire shrank not at its borders, but in its records. Entire regions that once sang in Latin now hummed in silence. The tax system, still sprawling, still meticulous, had become an echo. It spoke in ratios and formulas, but it no longer described a world that existed. It recorded what used to be, what should be, what no longer was. And this perhaps says the saddest truth of all. The empire's final collapse wasn't marked by invasion or fire. It was marked by silence on a tax scroll. One year, clerk notices that a particular village has not submitted its records. He sends a letter. No response. The following year, another letter. Still no reply. By the third year, the village is removed from the register, declared destroyed, just quietly erased. No entry, no note, no mourning, only a blank space. The numbers outlasted the people, and in their absence, the scrolls continued. Tallies were adjusted, totals revised. The machinery of empire, like an abandoned mill, kept spinning long after the grain was gone. Even centuries later, medieval scribes found copies of Roman tax documents and marveled at their precision. Here, one monk wrote, in the 9th century, the emperor listed how many jars of fish sauce were owed by each city. But where are these cities now? The answer was nowhere, or everywhere, because Rome, once so confident in its ability to measure, record, and assess every inch of its territory, has been reduced to paper. Its strength wasn't its armies, its temples, or its emperors. It was its ledgers, and in the end, even those turned to dust. Today, fragments of those records still survive in pottery shards, in weathered tablets, in scrolls buried under centuries of soil. They speak of a world where everything had a cost, every breath, every tool, every child, and we are left to wonder if an empire lives on in numbers, but no one reads them. Was it the empire that collapsed her, just our memory of how it kept score? You've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. And once, cool, that was true. Over 250,000 miles of road, stretching across continents, carved through mountains, bridged over rivers, slicing across forests, plains, and deserts. An infrastructure of astonishing ambition, built stone by soldiers, slaves, and engineers whose names were mostly forgotten the moment the mortar dried. But the roads remembered. Even when the empire forgot, at its peak, the Roman road system was more than just movement. It was a promise that you could step into the dust of a small village in Hispania and, with time and patience, arrive at the Senate gates in the heart of Rome. That orders given in Ravenna could be carried to Dacia, that wheat harvested in Africa could feed mouths in Gaul, that messengers from Syria, sweat-drenched and wide-eyed, could gallop into Rome before the week was over. The roads made the empire feel manageable. They were straight, deliberate, disciplined, built with deep foundations, layered with gravel, stone, and paving slabs, then crowned with milestones each marking the distance from the capital. The first thing any invading general did after conquering new territory, he built a road, because control wasn't about banners or statues, it was about connection. But then, as centuries passed, the empire stopped growing, and the roads began to lead backward. By the 4th century, Rome was no longer the center of command. Emperors ruled from Milan, then Ravenna, then Constantinople. The capital itself was ceremonial theater of marble and memory. And yet, the roads still led to it. That became a problem. The roads, once arteries of power, had become liabilities. They worked both ways. Enemies no longer had to fight there, wade through tangled forests or crooked paths. They could follow the empire's own roads, paved and mapped straight to its heart. When the Goths crossed the Danube in the late 4th century, they followed Roman roads. When Alaric marched on Rome in 410 CE, he moved along the Via Flaminia. When the Vandals swept through Gaul, they followed the Via Agrippa. The same paths used by soldiers were now used by those who came to burn what remained. A senator in Rome reportedly lamented, "We paved the world to make it Roman, and now the world marches those same stones to unmake us." But invasion wasn't the only threat. The empire itself could no longer afford to maintain the roads. The engineering manuals still existed. The know-how had not vanished. What had vanished was the budget. Toll stations were abandoned. Milestones fell and were not replaced. Bridges collapsed, and no one was sent to inspect the damage. The roads cracked from frost. Weeds grew in the seams. In wet climates, like Britannia and the Rhineland, roads vanished beneath the mud. In drier regions, they became narrow tracks lined with dust and regret. And yet, the roads still gave the illusion of function. An imperial courier might ride for hours on a broken stone path, pretending he was still serving an empire that ruled from the sea to the sands. But the outposts were gone. The storehouses were empty. The fortresses along the road stood like husks. People began to say, "The road goes far, but what awaits at its end?" Some stopped using them altogether. In Gaul, villagers began building houses on top of the roads, placing stones across the route, raising huts in the middle of intersections. Why? Because the roads were the only flat, cleared ground. They were no longer pathways. They were platforms. In parts of North Africa, Roman roads became sheep trails. In the Levant, they were mined for stone to build churches. In Britannia, they were renamed Devil's Causeways, Ghostways, the Long Stone. The names had changed because the purpose. Rome had once believed that connectivity would be its immortality. But when the destinations disappeared, the connections meant less. Still, in the eastern half of the empire, what became Byzantium, some roads continued. In Anatolia, traders still moved silk and spices. In the Balkans, armies still marched. But in the west, the network frayed into nonsense. Roads that once connected provinces now ended in thickets or fields. Signs pointed nowhere. Bridges crossed dry riverbeds. Milestones marked distances to cities that no longer existed. One traveler from the 6th century described riding a Roman road through Italy, then stopping in a village where no one could read Latin. They asked him where he had come from. He replied, "From the stones." They laughed. He wept, because the empire had built its legacy in stone. And yet, the stones no longer led anywhere real. They led to ghosts. The roads did not fail. They were abandoned. And still, they remain today. You can walk along parts of the Via Appia. You can trace the curves of ancient routes through hills where no one remembers the names carved into the milestones. But the grooves left by centuries of carts are still there. The flattened stones still whisper underfoot, and if you walk far enough in the right light, you might believe the empire still waits at the end. But what do you find? A ruined forum, a cracked column, silence deep enough to bury history, and you're left to ask if a road leads nowhere, but still remembers where it was meant to go. Is the empire truly gone, or just waiting for someone to follow? Asterisk. There's a strange comfort in a road, even when it leads nowhere. Even when the cities at either end have crumbled to dust, the path itself remains a line scratched across the land, hinting that once people moved with purpose. And so, In the centuries after Rome's western collapse, people kept walking the roads, not because they believed in Rome, but because the roads were the only thing that still made sense. A path meant predictability. Even in decline, it's 478 CE. Now, you're walking along the Via Emilia, once the pride of northern Italy. You pass fields that no longer feed cities. You see milestones that mark distances to names you've never heard. Tays nest in way stations. Ivy coils around toppled statues. The road buckles slightly where an old aqueduct collapsed in a forgotten quake. And still, you walk, because there's no better way. The locals you meet don't call it Via Emilia anymore. Call it the old way. They use it to reach distant markets, to drive sheep between hills. Some walk its length each spring to reach a shrine, half buried in vines. Once dedicated to Jupiter, now rededicated to a Christian martyr whose name is already being shortened with time. Along the way, you find signs of older travelers. Grooves, worn into stone by chariot wheels, Latin graffiti fading under lichen, a broken sandal left beside a roadside ditch. Someone has carved a cross into a milestone. Someone else has scratched out the emperor's name. The stone does not resist. It simply records. You meet a merchant pushing a cart filled with salt. He doesn't speak Latin, but he wears a ring carved with SBQR. He says it belonged to his grandfather. He doesn't know what the letters mean, but he believes it keeps him safe on the road. And so the roads have become something else entirely. Not lines of empire, but arteries of memory. The infrastructure remains, but is detached from its creators. It has become folklore. The roads were once built by orders from engineers, by men with maps and vision. Now they are maintained by superstition, chance, and need. In some areas, local warlords begin to charge tolls. They guard short stretches of road and collect coin from travelers who still believe these routes offer protection. The roads are only as safe as the men who claimed them. But still, they are used, because even a broken path is better than no path at all. And there is something else, something quieter. Even as the empire disintegrates politically, socially, spiritually, the roads have become a way of holding on. People travel them not just to reach a destination, but to feel that they are still part of something larger, that the world still connects, that the boundaries once drawn in stone haven't entirely faded. Some monks begin walking the roads as acts of devotion. Pilgrims follow them to remote churches, to tombs of saints. Children are taught to count distances by the intervals between rest stops. Stories begin to form about how the roads were built. Some say by giants, others by gods. The historical truth of Roman surveyors, legionary engineers, slave labor, and careful planning is forgotten. But the roads themselves remain sacred. One medieval traveler, walking a Roman road near Lyon, wrote in his journal, "The stones are old, but they remember our feet. I feel less alone when I walk them." That's what the roads had become. Companions. They didn't promise arrival anymore, but they offered direction. And in a world unraveling, that was enough. In Britain, Roman roads were overgrown, but never erased. The Saxons avoided them, at first calling them cursed or haunted by the old empire. But eventually, they used them too. Their own names replaced the Latin ones. But the stones were the same dot in Gaul. Peasants used old roads to escape new wars. In Hispania, bandits chased carts down crumbling paths lined with forgotten milestones. In North Africa, camel caravans cut across roads that had once carried wheat to Caesar's granaries. And so the roads endured not as Rome's claim, but as its shadow. They became the ghost of infrastructure. Even in the Eastern Roman Empire, emperors still ruled from Constantinople. Roads were still revered. But even there, decay set in. Roads were patched, not rebuilt. Stations turned into shrines. Maps grew outdated, but always the roads remained legible, because even when the writing fades, the shape of a road holds, and that's what Rome had built best, not permanence, but pattern, a way of thinking about space, a belief that the world could be measured, ordered, mapped, reached. So, what happened when those roads no longer reached anywhere? People walked them anyway, and in doing so, they kept something alive, not the empire, but the imagination of it, because to follow a Roman road centuries after Rome was to believe in connection, to believe that someone, somewhere, once cared enough to carve a path through wilderness. To believe that ruins were still roots, and you're left to ask, if a road no longer leads to power, but still leads people forward, has it truly lost its purpose? Asterisk, long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the roads remained, and in many places, they still do, not just as cracked stone paths in the countryside, but as patterns beneath modern cities, as roots that refuse to vanish, as the unconscious paths we still follow centuries later, without knowing why. In Rome itself, the Via Appia still stretches outward, paved in dark basalt stones, worn smooth by time. Neath it, the ancient ruts made by ox-drawn carts are still visible. If you crouch down and press your palm against those grooves, you are touching decisions made over 2,000 years ago. Not in battle, but in planning. In Britain, highways like the A1 follow the course of Roman routes. In France, road networks still hug the ancient Via Agrippa. In the Balkans, dusty rural paths match maps that date back to Augustus, because roads, even when unused, still shape the land. They resist erase to raise through strength, but through familiarity. Farmers plow around them, builders repave them, travelers favor them, even when the empires that laid them have turned to dust. Why? Because Roman roads were built with vision. Their engineers didn't just connect towns, they connected time. They imagined generations walking those same lines. They imagined soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and farmers, all treading the same path, for reasons unknown, yet utterly human. They didn't just map geography, they mapped intent, and even when intent vanishes, habit remains. By the 6th and 7th centuries, much of the Western Empire had devolved into local rule. Kingdoms rose where provinces once stood. Kings crowned themselves in places once governed by prefects. Languages evolved, coins changed, but the roads endured. Why rebuild, after all, when the old road still points the way? In some villages, elders told children never to stray too far from the Roman road. It was said to lead to food, to shelter, to safety. Even when none of those things were still true, in other stories grew of phantoms that walked the road at night, of ghostly legions marching silently past ruined milestones, of travelers who followed a Roman path for weeks, only to find themselves in lands no longer marked by name. These were not superstitions. They were memories distorted, yes, but grounded in something real, because people knew that someone had once made sense of this space, had once named it, tamed it, paved it, had once made the wilderness, W-A-L-K-A-B-L-E, in the city of Trier, one of the oldest cities in Germany. Roman roads still cut beneath medieval streets. The shops may have changed, the language too, but the angles of the stones remain. A man buying bread in 700 CE walked the same pattern as a senator's courier in 300 CE without knowing it, because the empire never really left. It just went underground. Even in collapse, the roads served. They carried pilgrims to new churches. They guided refugees away from wars. They offered a traceable path through chaos, and in doing so, it became a kind of shelter, not of walls or roofs, but of direction. To walk a Roman road, even one choked with weeds or lined with ruin, was to feel part of something, to feel not entirely lost. That's what Rome left behind. Not answers, but orientation. Not order, but the memory of order. And now, centuries later, we still echo that instinct. Modern Europe, its highways, its rail lines, even its air routes mirror the old Roman roads. When satellites trace global shipping patterns, they often align with Roman trade maps. When civil engineers dig to lay water lines or fiber cables, they sometimes strike Roman foundations still straight, still firm. And in those moments, the empire rises again, not in marble or armies, but in stone and line. We remember Rome not because it conquered, but because it connected, because it carved its presence into the earth, because it dared to believe that space could be shaped and that people would follow, even if the people changed, even if the empire died, even if the roads no longer led anywhere. A 19th century poet, walking the Via Domitia in southern France, wrote, "These stones do not ask who I am. They only ask that I walk forward." That, perhaps, is the empire's truest legacy. Not the laws, not the language, not even the glory, but the road, the line across the land that invites movement. The path that reminds us that once, long ago, someone stood here and decided to go somewhere. And we're left to ask, if an empire vanishes, but its roads remained, did it ever truly fall? Or did it simply change the way it moved? Asterisk, it was never loud. When the aqueducts failed, there were no horns, no riots, no dramatic speeches carved into stone. There was only a strange quiet in the fountains. The trickle slowed, the basins emptied, tenant. Nothing. Rome, the eternal city, once fed by the most advanced water system the ancient world had ever known, learned what it meant to thirst not just for water, but for the systems that made life predictable. At its peak, ancient Rome was fed by 11 aqueducts, some stretching over 50 miles from distant springs and mountain sources. These aqueducts were marvels of engineering, arched stone skeletons crawling across hills, ducking through tunnels, leveling through valleys, whispering gravity's secrets, one drop at a time. They didn't just bring water to the city, they brought dignity. Water was what separated the Roman from the barbarian. A Roman bathed daily. A Roman drank from marble fountains. A Roman dined with fresh water poured from silver jugs. Even the poor had access to public basins and the city's thermal baths. Vast, echoing temples of steam hummed with the steady rhythm of water arriving on schedule. The aqueducts were Rome's quiet miracle, and their disappearance was equally quiet. It began with a crack, not metaphorically, literal crack. A stone out of place, a tree root finding purchase, a small leak that went unpatched. The Aqua Marcia, one of the longest and most beloved aqueducts, suffered a partial collapse outside Tiber. There had once been a team of engineers curatoriae, Quarum, who monitored every inch of Rome's water supply. They had maps, crews, repairmen. By the 5th century, most had been dismissed or had simply vanished. The city's wealth could no longer sustain bureaucrats who only managed water. That money now went to soldiers, to bribes, to emergency repairs of walls and churches. The empire no longer thought in decades. It thought in afternoons, and so the crack remained, and the water slowed. At first, people didn't panic. Fountains ran for a few hours instead of all day, and bathhouses limited their hours. A priest at the Temple of Venus noted that the ceremonial basin was dry before the ritual had ended. It was inconvenient, not catastrophic. But then came drought, and came siege. In 537 CE, the Eastern Roman general Belisarius, under Emperor Justinian, entered Italy to reclaim it from the Ostrogoths. His arrival in Rome was triumphant. Achilles, the Eastern Empire, would restore order, dignity, as most importantly, Roman infrastructure. But the Ostrogoths, seeing that they could not retake the city by storm, chose a simpler method. They cut the aqueducts. They knew the arches. They knew the weak points. And in a matter of days, the great channels that had fed Rome for centuries were shattered. The fountains stopped. The baths closed. The mills fell silent. And the Tiber, muddy and sluggish, became the city's only source. Belisarius tried to repair the aqueducts, but the siege pressed on. Food grew scarce. Sanitation worsened. The Romans began to collect rainwater in broken pots, to boil water pulled from shallow wells. Disease followed. One chronicler wrote, "The city of water has become the city of thirst. We carry it in jars. Like peasants, the fountains are now stones." Even after the siege lifted, the aqueducts were never fully restored. There was no time, no money, no trained workforce. Rome had become a shadow of itself, its population reduced from over 1 million to less than 50,000, its streets lined with rubble, its statues looted, its people quiet. And so the aqueducts remained looming, broken, silent. They stood as reminders of a city that once expected water to arrive on its own, a city that had forgotten how to carry a bucket in the centuries that followed. The aqueducts served other purposes. Bandits used their arches for ambushes. Monks sheltered livestock in their shade. Farmers chipped away at the stone to build huts. In one village, children played a game, running beneath the arches and shouting to hear the echo. None of them knew why the arches had been built, only that they had always been there. In the Middle Ages, travelers entering the ruins of Rome often mistook the aqueducts for pagan temples or the walls of some long-lost castle. The idea that they had once carried clean water across hills and rivers was almost unimaginable. And yet the arches remained marching across the countryside like ribs from a buried animal.